The good thing is this is a pretty good film, but the bad thing is, depending on your level of Elvis fandom or obsession, this will probably be very polarizing. Now, I am a fan of Elvis, but not a hardcore fan. So I know the basic facts of his biography, his origins, his rise, his line, seeing Nixon, the mythology and the legend, him serving in the army. He led a fairly full life. There's a lot to go through. And I do appreciate how the director tried to make it more lively by doing this technique of skipping back and forth in Elvis's life. This is not a chronological musical biopic. It is a biopic, but it is trying to do things, I think, to avoid the cliches of the biopic. I just don't think it's as successful as you might hope. I will say, if you are a massive Kubrick fan, there is a lot of Kubrick in this, and it starts off right away. I was shocked. The first 10 minutes, there is a incredibly explicit Kubrick reference, and I was like, "Oh, okay." So I appreciate that he is trying to have a conversation not just with American musical history, but American film history. So it's a very interesting film on many levels. And the central performance, I think, was fairly electrifying. And given the burden, right, because this is basically one of the biggest icons of all time, not even music history, really, that's a large bill to fulfill. And I do think the actor did a pretty spectacular job. The problem is the direction and the editing, especially, is very, very problematic in many places because I usually try to give directors as much of a kind of, for lack of a better word, devil's advocate. So even if it's not my style or my genre or even my particular thing, I'm like, okay, this is the director and or writer's vision. Let's see where it goes. That's how I treat Ryan Johnson. That's how I treat Zack Snyder, even J.J. Abrams, even people I think are a little problematic. I'm like, okay, let's go with what they're going with and see if it's a good or bad story. I do think the basic story is good. The film is very, very accurate in certain places, especially with young Elvis and the way he met a lot of black people and was soaked up in kind of black musical culture. They confronted that issue, I think, fairly squarely and pretty fairly because people think Elvis is this kind of culture vulture. He and a lot of black musicians had a pretty good back and forth, but they are kind of honest about the music industry basically stealing black music, but not Elvis. So I do think they dealt with the issue as best as you can do within this kind of story. However, they do play fast and loose with other aspects of his life, and that was a little regretful. They really didn't need to do that, and they just create an antagonist out of nowhere. And I'm sure that Elvis did have rivals, he did have antagonists. Basically, they built up this weirdo Tom Hanks character, and the performance was also really shaky, and it's just not really there. They just needed some villain guy for Elvis to play off against, and it really didn't help the story. So I don't know why they did that. So they do something very, very accurately, but then other things are just complete fantasy. And the style of directing will sometimes be just very whiplash. It'll just be try to be very serious, very comedic, and then it'll just do this massive tonal shift. Sometimes it works, but a lot of times it doesn't work. And I do appreciate he keeps switching up the style because some sections are animated or it has a kind of weirdo comic book format, but it looks kind of cheap. I don't know why they thought that would improve things. This is a very mixed bag, but I do think it's more good than bad. They go through, of course, some of his greatest hits. He's a very charismatic personality, and I do think the actor really captured that. And again, when it's in a kind of subjective POV of how Elvis is overwhelmed by his own fame, I thought that was very effective. There are a lot of sequences where it's just him grappling with his own legacy. That made a lot of sense, but I do think they made a lot of key mistakes and just rushing through things very quickly in certain parts of his life. And then other places, they just linger, and you're like, why are we lingering here? What's the point of this? Maybe if you're a more hardcore Elvis fan, you'll appreciate the Easter eggs, but it just felt kind of all over the place. And I do appreciate that Baz had a really impossible task to make this story, probably which a lot of people are already familiar with, and do something quote new with it. I just think they took the wrong approach in certain places. But overall, it is a good film. Is it good enough for you to pay for in the theater? That's kind of hard to say. I do think if you're an admirer of auteur style, you will appreciate this and maybe you'll think, on balance, this is a really great film. I can only say it was pretty good. I would give it something like a 7.65. I don't know if it's strong enough for you to pay the full price for the ticket. I would say check it out, but maybe just wait to rent it. It's definitely an interesting addition to the Baz canon, but it is a very, very mixed bag. I am recommending it, but again, you want to come in and have not low expectations, but don't expect a great biopic. It's not that. Also, it's not a great music biopic because they omit certain things or certain songs, which you think would be critical. It's very much all over the place. I do think there's more good things than bad things. I do think the cast overall, except for Tom Hanks, who usually is never bad, but I just think his character, the way it was done, it was so over the top and ridiculous. If they're doing kind of Kubrick thing, he is kind of like a Doctor Strangelove kind of character, like this. He's not a Nazi, but he is very much a walking stereotype of this overly authoritarian male figure. I guess he's like a symbol of the 1950s conservatism. I don't know, but it was after a while, I was just like, this is really getting weak and silly and stupid. It's not adding things. So there's a lot of great moments in this, far more good moments than bad moments, but it does reach a few low points, and after a while, you wish the editing was a lot sharper and tighter. A lot of good Kubrick Easter eggs, a lot of good Elvis Easter eggs, a lot of good cinematic Easter eggs, but also just a lot of flashy trash. And I wish it was just more disciplined. There we are. A mixed bag, but a good bag with Elvis. But again, be ready to be disappointed in many ways.